Marissa Cole never imagined she would be blindsided in her own living room, staring at her husband across the wide expanse of polished hardwood floors, while he waved a stack of legal papers in her face like some sort of trophy. The ceiling fan above did little to ease the sticky Brookford heat pressing against her skin or the pounding in her temples. Please like and subscribe to my channel for more contents. At 42, she was a sales manager for a tech firm that paid well enough to keep them comfortable. But no job, no savings, no amount of Southern grit could prepare her for this. Darren Blake, her husband of 3 years, stood there with a smirk carved into his face as though he had rehearsed it in the mirror. "I don't need you any more, Marissa," he said, his voice cruelly casual, like they were discussing the weather. Her chest tightened, but before she could respond, he delivered the real blow. "Dad's bank account has $900 million in it. I'm set for life. You were just the ATM until I got it." The words landed like a punch to the gut, knocking the air from her lungs. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, nails biting into her palms. She had seen glimpses of Darren's selfishness before. Little things, like how he always found a way to dodge household chores or how he could turn on that boyish grin to get himself out of trouble. But this was something colder, uglier. He had married her, played the part of a loving husband, all while quietly counting down to the day his father died so he could cash in. And now Edward Blake was barely in the ground, gone less than a week, and Darren was already talking about his inheritance as if it were a lottery ticket finally cashed. Edward had been nothing but kind to her, treating her as though she'd been his daughter all her life. The betrayal twisted inside her like a knife. For a moment, Marissa wanted to scream at him, to throw the vase of fresh lilies sitting on the coffee table, to demand how he could stand there and tarnish his father's name right after burying him. But somewhere in the storm of her thoughts, a calm voice seemed to whisper, one that sounded a lot like Edward's, urging her to hold her ground. "Stay steady, Marissa." She inhaled slowly, tasting the bitterness in the air, and reached for the papers without a word. Darren's smirk widened, confident he had her exactly where he wanted her. She clicked the pen, signed her name with deliberate precision, and then looked up at him, her eyes steady. "Fine," she said evenly. "File them yourself. Send my things when you're done." She placed the pen down like a judge, laying down a verdict, and turned for the door. The screen door creaked as she stepped onto the wraparound porch, the humid air wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. The manicured lawn stretched before her, the oak trees casting long shadows across the grass. She descended the steps without looking back, each footfall lighter than the last. Relief, strange, unexpected relief, mingled with the anger still burning in her chest. Darren thought he'd just won, but the man was about to find out that the $900 million he was already planning to spend was nothing more than a mirage. She knew the truth, and soon he would too. 3 days later, Marissa was holed up in a hotel downtown, the kind of place where the carpet smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and the air conditioning hummed like a lullaby. She sat cross-legged on the bed, scrolling through condo listings, trying to picture her life without Darren's shadow looming over it. Her phone buzzed, lighting up with his name. She almost ignored it, but curiosity got the better of her. She answered with a clipped hello. On the other end, Darren's voice came through like a storm about to break. "What the hell did you do, Marissa?" he barked, so loud she had to pull the phone away from her ear. "What are you talking about?" she asked coolly, leaning back against the headboard. Darren was breathing hard, his words tumbling over one another. "I went to the bank to pull money from Dad's account, and they said it's locked." "Locked, Marissa?" "They said there's $900 million in there, but I can't touch a single cent." "What's going on?" She let the question hang in the air, almost savoring the panic dripping from his voice. Finally, she said, "You didn't know, did you?" There was silence on the other end. "Didn't know what?" Marissa exhaled slowly. "Edward never told you about his business because you never cared to ask. That $900 million you think is yours? It's not. It's collateral." Darren's voice cracked. Collateral? What the hell does that mean? She let her words land like hammer blows. Your father poured everything into that community center project in East Brookford. It failed. He borrowed $900 million against his savings. If he couldn't pay it back, and he couldn't, it all goes to the bank. You can't touch a dime. The line went quiet, the silence stretching long enough for her to imagine Darren's face, pale and slack with disbelief. You're saying there's nothing, he finally whispered. Nothing, she confirmed, her voice steady. The only thing your father left you is $75,000. That's your inheritance. There was a strangled sound, half laugh, half gasp. 75,000. Darren's voice was breaking now. I've already spent more than that this month. I thought, he trailed off, as if the weight of reality had just pinned him to the floor. Marissa leaned her head back, closing her eyes. You thought you'd hit the jackpot, she said softly, but you never once talked to your father about his plans. You just saw dollar signs. Darren's words started to tumble again. Please now, not accusations. Marissa, please. You've got savings, a good job. I've got nothing. I'm 43, unemployed, with barely enough to get by. We can call off the divorce. I'll change. Just don't leave me like this. Her grip on the phone tightened, but her voice stayed calm. You made your choices, Darren. You don't get to lean on me anymore. Figure it out. And with that, she hung up, letting the silence fill the room. She stared at the muted city lights outside her window, the distant hum of traffic reminding her she was free now. Not the grieving widow she once was. Not the wife trapped in a lie. She was Marissa Cole, and for the first time in years, the path ahead belonged entirely to her. In the quiet after hanging up, Marissa felt the memories creeping in like shadows under a door, tugging her back to the days before Darren Blake had ever been a name in her life. She hadn't always been this jaded. For years earlier, she'd been married to Matthew Cole, a quiet man who worked construction and loved nothing more than weekend fishing trips and grilling on their tiny apartment balcony. They weren't rich, but they were content, steadily saving for a modest home in one of Brookford's leafy suburbs. Then, one gray winter morning, her phone rang with a call that shattered her world. There'd been an accident on one of Matthew's job sites. The words, he didn't make it, seemed to echo endlessly in her ears, their finality slamming into her like a freight train. The grief was a living thing, heavy and relentless. She went through the motions, funeral arrangements, condolences from neighbors, but nothing could pierce the fog she lived in. Between the life insurance payout and a severance package from Matthew's company, Marissa found herself with $500,000. It was more money than she'd ever imagined holding, but in her heart it felt like blood money. Matthew's parents, kind and soft-spoken people in their late 70s, told her to keep it. We don't need it, honey, his mother had said, her voice trembling. You're young. Use it to start over. She tried offering some of it to Matthew's brother and his wife, but they refused, insisting it was hers. At 39, she was widowed and suddenly wealthier than she'd ever been, yet utterly alone. She kept working, throwing herself into sales pitches and client meetings, closing deals like it was the only thing that tethered her to the world. But at night, her apartment felt too quiet. She'd still brew 2 cups of coffee in the morning out of habit, staring at the extra mug until her chest ached. The silence pressed in on her like a weight. And that was when Darren Blake appeared, not as a whirlwind, but as a slow, steady presence. Darren was a sales rep for a partner company, the kind of man who could light up a room with a grin and a perfectly timed joke. He was 43, but carried himself with a boyish ease that made people overlook the faint lines around his eyes. They'd crossed paths at networking events before, exchanging pleasantries about clients, the state of the tech market. But one afternoon at a conference coffee bar, their conversation shifted. She found herself telling him about Matthew's death, about the loneliness that gnawed at her, about feeling like she was going through the motions of life without really living it. Most people would have fumbled for an excuse to leave, but Darren listened, his head tilted slightly, eyes steady. He offered small, well-timed jokes that made her laugh for the first time in months. "Your husband was lucky to have you," he'd said softly, then grinned. "Me? I'm terrible at relationships. I get dumped faster than a bad blind date." She laughed again, not realizing she'd given him an opening into her life. They began meeting outside of work. Drinks at a midtown pub, walks along the Brookford River Walk, sharing stories about their childhoods. Darren had grown up in Brookford under the shadow of his father, Edward Blake, a real estate developer who'd made millions flipping properties. His mother had left when Darren was young, chasing the kind of lavish lifestyle Edward refused to fund. In Darren's telling, Edward was a stubborn, old-fashioned man, stingy with praise and money alike. "He could have built a mansion," Darren would say bitterly. "Instead, we were stuck in a brick box while he poured money into other people's problems." She didn't see it then, but his resentment toward his father ran deep, a chip on his shoulder he wore like armor. At the time, she only saw the way Darren made her feel less alone, the way he could pull her out of her grief with a story or a crooked smile. A year after they began dating, Darren proposed over pulled pork sandwiches at a hole-in-the-wall barbecue joint. "Marissa, we're not getting any younger," he'd said, his eyes bright with that impulsive energy she'd grown to expect. "Why don't we just get married?" She'd laughed at first, thinking it was a joke, but he was serious. Friends warned her she was moving too fast, but something in her, a desire for forward motion, for a life that wasn't defined by loss, pushed her to say yes. It wasn't until after she'd agreed that Darren casually mentioned he was living with his father. "He's been sick," Darren said with a shrug. "Needs help. You cool with that?" Marissa had frozen. He'd mentioned Edward before, but never in the context of illness. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she asked. "Didn't want to scare you off," he replied, like it was no big deal. Meeting Edward turned out to be nothing like she'd feared. The Blake house in suburban Brookford was a sprawling, 3-story red brick home with a wide lawn shaded by century-old oaks. It wasn't flashy, but it had a presence, a quiet kind of wealth that spoke of longevity, not showmanship. Edward greeted her from a recliner, his frame thinner than she'd expected, but his eyes sharp. "Sorry to meet you like this," he'd said warmly. "I'm not as spry as I used to be." They spoke for hours, diving into market trends and the shifting tech landscape. Edward understood her work in a way most people didn't, asking about integration strategies and new market risks. For a moment, she forgot she was meeting her future father-in-law and felt like she was sitting across from a mentor. Darren, meanwhile, spent most of the visit scrolling through his phone. They moved into the house a few months later, the arrangement pitched as practical. Plenty of space, and Edward needed help. Darren announced he would quit his sales job to care for his father full-time. "I've been a lousy son," he said one night, his tone unusually earnest. "Dad's done so much and I've done nothing. I want to step up." Marissa hesitated. Darren wasn't known for his follow-through, but eventually agreed. At first, it worked. She'd come home from work to find Darren cooking dinner, Edward sharing stories about community projects he'd funded. But the cracks began to show within weeks, and Marissa started to see a side of Darren she had been too blinded by grief to notice. Darren's dedication lasted barely a month. Soon, the vacuum lines in the carpet faded, the sink piled with dishes, and the smell of takeout lingered in the kitchen. Marissa would come home exhausted from 10-hour days, only to find him sprawled on the couch, eyes glued to his phone. "Dinner's handled," he'd say, gesturing toward a paper bag on the counter. Edward noticed too. One evening, when Darren had disappeared to run errands for the 3rd time that week, Edward called Marissa into his study. The warm lamplight fell over photos of ribbon cuttings and parks, the walls lined with shelves of real estate ledgers. "I thought marriage might straighten him out," Edward said quietly, his face lined with regret. "He's always been careless. I'm sorry you're dealing with this." She forced a smile, But deep down, the truth was setting in. Darren wasn't just careless, he was waiting. It all became clear the afternoon she came home to a gleaming vintage Mustang in the driveway. Inside, Darren was unwrapping a new set of golf clubs. "Whose car is that?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Mine," he said without looking up. "You got your fancy bathroom from Dad. I deserve something too." The fancy bathroom had been Edward's doing, after overhearing her mention a leaky faucet. It was built to help him navigate with a wheelchair. Darren's car, on the other hand, was $30,000 of her savings, gone without permission. When she checked her account that night, she found nearly $50,000 missing in just 1 month, on clothes, gadgets, and whatever else had caught Darren's eye. She confronted him, slamming the bank statement on the counter. He only shrugged. "Dad's loaded. Once he's gone, we're set. What's the big deal?" It was weeks later, in Edward's study, that the truth came out. He asked her to help him review his affairs. No morbid sentiment. Just the practical habit of a man who had built and lost fortunes. That's when Marissa learned about the $900 million. Not a fortune waiting for Darren, but collateral, pledged against a massive loan to fund a community center project in East Brookford that had failed. Edward chuckled softly, though his eyes held sadness. "If I don't pay it back, the bank takes it all. Darren needs to know, but he's never been willing to listen." Marissa promised she would handle it if the time came, though a knot of dread settled in her stomach. When Edward passed suddenly from a heart attack, the house felt hollow. Marissa grieved the man who had treated her like family, who'd seen her worth when Darren only saw her bank account. She was still reeling when Darren walked in, eyes alight with the greed she now recognized too well. "Marissa, we need to talk," he said, holding up divorce papers. "Dad's bank account has $900 million. I'm set for life. I don't need you anymore. You were just the ATM while I waited." She could almost hear Edward's voice again. "Stay steady." She signed the papers on the spot, told him to file them himself, and walked out without looking back. Days later, the phone call came, Darren's voice frantic. "What did you do, Marissa?" "The bank says the account is locked. $900 million, and I can't touch it." She leaned back against the hotel headboard, almost smiling. "You didn't know," she said. "Your father's savings were collateral. The bank takes it to cover his debts. It's gone." Darren's disbelief crackled down the line. "Gone? You're saying there's nothing?" $75,000, she corrected. "That's what he left you." A choked laugh escaped him. "I've spent more than that already." His pleas began then. Offers to undo the divorce, promises to change, all of them empty to her ears. "You made your choices, Darren," she said evenly. "You don't get to lean on me anymore." She hung up, feeling a weight lift from her chest. Weeks later, a courier delivered a check for $35,000, half his inheritance. Maybe he thought fighting over it wasn't worth the trouble. From friends, she heard he'd gone back to sales, botched a few deals, and quit after a month. Now he was driving part-time for a delivery service, burning through what little money he had left. She didn't wish him harm, but his struggles no longer belonged to her. Marissa found a small but sunlit condo in Midtown Brookford, with a balcony overlooking the river and the skyline beyond. She deposited the $35,000 into her savings, not to spend, but as a reminder of Edward Blake's belief in doing what mattered. Her days were long again, pitches, contracts, handshakes, but her evenings were hers. The air in her home carried only the sound of her own choosing. She was no longer the widow adrift in grief, nor the wife trapped in a hollow marriage. She was Marissa Cole, and the path ahead was hers alone, steady, deliberate, and unshakable. Marissa settled into her new condo with a quiet determination, arranging each piece of furniture as if reclaiming her place in the world. The space was smaller than the Blake house, but it was hers, every corner free from the tension and entitlement that had filled her old life. In the mornings, she would step out onto the balcony, coffee in hand, watching the fictional Brookford skyline shimmer in the pale gold of sunrise. The air smelled of rain and magnolia, and she could hear the faint clink of cafe cups from the street below. She began rediscovering her own rhythms. Late-night reading, without someone questioning the light, weekend trips to the farmer's market, long phone calls with friends she distanced herself from during her marriage. There was no more Darren pacing the halls, plotting a future he thought was guaranteed. His absence wasn't a void, it was room to breathe. One evening, after closing a major deal at work, she brought home a small bottle of champagne and poured herself a single glass. Standing at the balcony rail, she let the warm city breeze brush her face, the hum of Brookford at night rising from below. She thought of Edward Blake, the man who had seen her value long before she'd learned to stand firm in it herself. She toasted to him softly, then to the woman she had become. Not the widow lost in grief, nor the wife chained to someone else's greed, but a woman who had chosen freedom over false promises. Somewhere across the city, Darren was learning that easy money was nothing but a mirage. Marissa didn't wish him harm, but she no longer carried his burden. Her life was her own again, and as the lights blinked across the skyline, she knew that was worth more than $900 million ever could be. Like and subscribe to my channel for more contents like this, and let us know where you are watching from under the comment section.